After an almost uninterrupted 4-month-long string of Union successes beginning in early 1862, followed by the advance of a 100,000-man enemy army to the eastern outskirts of its capital at Richmond, Virginia, the Confederacy suddenly finds itself in a life-or-death struggle for its very survival. By mid-June of 1862, Major General George B. McClellan has deployed 5 Union infantry corps within 6 miles of the city, 1 north of the rain-swollen Chickahominy River and 4 on the south side, backed by an imposing array of big siege guns. On the Confederate side, General Robert E. Lee, benefiting from McClellan's sluggish advance up the peninsula between the York and James Rivers, has in a matter of weeks managed to concentrate his outnumbered forces and improve the defenses around the city. Lee is convinced that he can't win a war of attrition or mount a successful defense of Richmond fighting from behind breastworks and siege entrenchments. And so, using valuable intelligence gained from his Army's senior cavalry commander, Brigadier General Jeb Stuart, during the Cavaliers' now famous Ride Around McClellan from June 12th-15th, the audacious General Lee devises an elaborate plan for a counteroffensive. He will shatter the Union right flank north of the Chickahominy, throwing the Army the Potomac's line of supply, the Richmond and York River Railroad running back to White House Landing on the Pamunkey River, and forced McClellan to evacuate his siege works east of the city to defend his vital supply lines. If you're interested in gaining the same valuable intelligence like Jeb Stuart on his famous ride, you should check out Blinkist. You may ask, what is Blinkist? Well, I'm here to tell you. Blinkist will help you discover fantastic ideas that will widen your knowledge on a variety of subjects in only 15 minutes. Blinkist offers the best selection of non-fiction books which pulls out the key takeaways and puts them into 15-minute text and audio explainers called Blinks for immediate moments of meaningful inspiration. One of my favorites include Killing Lincoln, which talks about the famous moments that led up to and after Lincoln's assassination. The most interesting part of the Blink is about how John Wilkes Booth heard about where Lincoln will be, thanks to an overexcited promoter who wanted to tell the public that the Lincolns will be in attendance at Ford's Theater. It'd be interesting to think about how the timeline would be if the promoter did not announce to the world that the president will be there that night. With more than 5,000 titles from 27 categories, even recent bestsellers, there's almost an unlimited amount of knowledge to gain. Use the link in the description to get a free 7-day trial and 25% off a premium membership when signing up to Blinkist. A big thanks to Blinkist for sponsoring this video. Although Lee had performed superbly in the Mexican War, he was brevetted 3 times and deemed by General-in-Chief Winfield Scott to be the best soldier he had ever seen in the field. Lee has yet to command a large army in the field. He had assumed his current command just 2 days into June, after General Joseph E. Johnston was wounded at the Battle of Seven Pines on the evening of May 31st. On June 2nd, Lee had inherited a loose-knit army composed of Johnston's Manassas veterans, the original Army of the Peninsula Defensive Force, commanded by Major General John B. Magruder, and a mixture of untested reinforcements, mostly from Georgia, Virginia, and the Carolinas, which he officially christens the Army in Northern Virginia. With his new forces, Lee moves to drive the huge Union juggernaut, the largest army ever assembled on the North American continent to that point, away from its works in front of the Confederate capital. After Seven Pines, McClellan sits passively on the outskirts of Richmond for almost a month, but by mid-June he has finally advanced his 94,000 effectives to the city's gates. General Fitz John Porter's 5th Corps, 27,000 strong, is positioned north of the Chickahominy, holding the high ground overlooking the small hamlet of Mechanicsville, while those of Brigadier Generals Samuel P. Heintzelman, Erasmus D. Keyes, Edwin B. Sumner, and William B. Franklin, numbering 67,000 men in all, remain south of the river. Believing his army outnumbered, McClellan's objective now is to advance just a bit farther west, capture Old Tavern on the 9-mile road, entrench, and begin a classic siege operation, a repetition of a siege against Yorktown 2 months earlier, but with decisive results for the final outcome of the war. When Richmond falls, the war would be won. McClellan's intelligence chief, Alan Pinkerton, is a competent railroad detective but an abysmal intelligence officer. In June of 1862, he estimates that the Confederates in and around Richmond number at least 180,000, and McClellan believes him. To get approval to carry out his bold but risky counteroffensive, Lee convinces Confederate President Jefferson Davis that McClellan will use his vast force to fight a war of outposts, moving inexorably from position to position while his big siege guns pound Richmond into rubble. Lee outlines an intricate scheme that will send 3/4 of his army under cover of darkness north of the river, leaving 23,000 defenders to repulse McClellan's main force south of the river should he discover what Lee is up to and mount an attack on the capital. Considering the direness of the situation, the Confederate government is preparing to flee Richmond if necessary. General Lee believes the stakes are high enough to warrant the gamble. Central to Lee's plan of operations is maneuver. Major General Stonewall Jackson will furtively return from the Shenandoah Valley, which Lee sends orders for him to do on June 16th, and advance southeasterly around the reported enemy right flank near the headwaters of Beaver Dam Creek, his left protected by Jeb Stuart's 2,000 cavalry troopers. Upon Jackson's arrival in the area, he will still be at least 7 miles from Lee's main force. Therefore, early in the morning on June 26, Brigadier General Lawrence O'Brien Branch's brigade of Major General Ambrose Powell Hill's Light Division moves up the Chickahominy to the river crossing at Half Sink, where he will establish contact with Jackson upon the latter's arrival at the Brook Turnpike. Then, after notifying Hill of Jackson's presence, Branch will lead his brigade down the river on a parallel route with Jackson's men, brushing aside any threat to Jackson's right. When Hill's certain that Branch and Jackson are on the move, he'll lead his other 5 infantry brigades, 11,000 strong, across the Chickahominy at Meadow Bridge, pivot, and drive eastward towards Mechanicsville, 2 miles away. After A.P. Hill's troops move through the city, the Mechanicsville Bridge will be uncovered, allowing the divisions of Major Generals James Longstreet and Daniel Harvey Hill, who will be waiting with Lee at the Mechanicsville Bridge just south of the Chickahominy, to cross and fall behind the surging Confederate tide. Longstreet backing up Jackson and D.H. Hill supporting A.P. Hill, with vast enemy columns advancing on his front, flank, and rear. Porter will be forced to abandon his position to avoid encirclement and annihilation. Implicit in Lee's scheme is that no major confrontation take place until Union forces east of Beaver Dam Creek have been flushed from their positions. After the carnage at Seven Pines, Lee wants no more assaults against entrenched enemy positions. There are profound risks inherent in Lee's plan. To begin with, Porter's 5th Corps occupies a formidably strong defensive position, one that Confederate engineers have scouted weeks earlier and determined to be almost impregnable. Beaver Dam Creek, a tributary of the Chickahominy, is a swampy body of water, waist deep in places, running north-south through a wide, deep ravine a mile east of Mechanicsville. Both banks are covered by thick underbrush and trees that Porter's men have fashioned into formidable abattis. On the west side of the creek lies an open plain swept and preceded by 6 Union artillery batteries, 32 guns in all, placed in earthen parapets so as to bracket all potential approaches. Along with the natural obstacles, McClellan has massive reserves of men available. 5 regiments of riflemen from John F. Reynolds' 1st Brigade at Brigadier General George A. McCall's 8,000-man 3rd Division, a formation in Porter's 5th Corps that is also known as the Pennsylvania Reserves Division, are deployed in a roughly north-south line astride Old Church Road northeast of the village, defending 60-foot high slopes east of Beaver Dam Creek. On their left, Brigadier General Truman Seymour's 3rd Brigade is dug into breastworks astride Cold Harbor Road, manning the high ground north and south of Ellerson's Mill, just north of Cold Harbor Road east of the creek. The grist mill's deep pond and millrace form natural barriers to any troops advancing on a west to east line. Brigadier General George Gordon Meade's 2nd Brigade is deployed in reserve to the rear. Porter's other 2 divisions, those of Brigadier Generals George W. Morrell and George Sykes, almost 20,000 men, hold an L-shaped line south and east of McCall's division. By sending 6 of his 10 divisions north of the Chickahominy, Lee will only have 4 small divisions of Major Generals John B. Magruder and Benjamin Huger left to defend the city. Lee is risking everything, his army, his capital, perhaps even his fledgling southern country's survival. By splitting his army to gain an advantage at a critical point, he's employing a classic Napoleonic tactic, but Emperor Bonaparte himself might have balked at attacking a heavily manned defensive force astride a rain-choked river backed by giant siege guns, less than 7 miles from his own country's capital. As usual, McClellan grossly underestimates his opponent. He tells President Lincoln he actually prefers fighting Lee to Joe Johnston. Lee is cautious and weak under grave responsibility, wanting in moral firmness when pressed by heavy responsibilities. McClellan asserts, and is likely to be timid and irresolute in action. Events will soon test the accuracy of his claims. The success of Lee's plan depends entirely on Jackson's timely arrival. After his reinforced Valley Army had begun the 100-mile trek to Richmond on June 18th, first by rail, then on foot, Jackson on the night of June 22nd rides non-stop for 14 miles, arriving at the capital for an afternoon conference the next day with Lee, Longstreet, and the Two Hills. Jackson's chief of staff, Major Robert Dabney, is ordered to keep Jackson's columns moving steadily forward in Jackson's absence, but proves unequal to the task. Inaccurate maps, straggling, muddy roads, and poor staff work slows the column's progress. After fighting 6 major engagements and marching more than 500 miles in less than 2 months, the Valley veterans are understandably fatigued. When the meeting ends, Jackson immediately rides back and rejoins his army, which has reached Beaver Dam Station in Hanover County, 30 miles from Beaver Dam Creek. Upon arrival, Jackson discovers to his regret that only the vanguard of his army is present. The rest is strung out for 15 miles northwest on muddy roads broken by swollen streams. Physically and mentally fatigued himself, the redoubtable Stonewall Jackson has only 48 hours to get his entire force to its assigned position near Richmond, 30 miles away, in time to meet Lee's timetable. According to Lee's General Orders No. 75, Jackson is to spend the next night at some convenient point west of the Virginia Central Railroad, and then move at 3 a.m. on June 26 towards his objective, Pole Green Church near Hunley's Corner, northeast of Richmond. When he passes the railroad on the morning of the 26th, Jackson is supposed to communicate his location to branch and continue advancing. Nowhere in Lee's somewhat ambiguous orders is there a specific mention of, or location for, an anticipated battle. In scorching heat and adverse conditions, the June 25th march proves extremely arduous. Jackson and his men arrive west of Ashland at sundown, still 6 miles short of their objective, /church. That night, Brigadier General Stewart and his 2,000 cavalrymen arrive with a 3-gun battery to deploy on Jackson's left for the next day's march. To compensate for the 6-mile shortfall, Jackson assures Lee that he will have his troops on the road by 2:30 a.m. By dawn on Thursday, June 26, 1862, Jackson has managed only 8 hours of sleep in the previous 4 days, has fallen feverishly ill, and bears little resemblance to the energetic tactician of the recently concluded Valley Campaign. Brigadier General William H.C. Whiting's division, with John Bell Hood's Texas Brigade in the vanguard, moves out on time, but it is well after 8 a.m. by the time Jackson's main force, 7 infantry brigades and 9 artillery batteries, get underway. Food and ammunition wagons bog down and are unable to keep pace, and the scarcity of fresh water in the Ashland area forces soldiers to scour the countryside in search of springs or wells. Once the Confederate column is finally on the road, Jackson pushes the men forward as best he can, but one delay after another impedes his progress. 4 abreast, the troops push forward over poor, muddy, unfamiliar roads. Their maps are woefully inadequate, and reports of enemy sightings bring the column to frequent halts. The column winds down Ashcake Road past /church and reaches the Virginia Central Railroad around 9 a.m., 6 miles behind schedule. Jackson dutifully informs Branch of his position by mounted courier, has a quick meal with his men, and resumes the march. The inexperienced Branch, in a costly blunder, fails to convey Jackson's message to A.P. Hill as ordered. Instead, upon receipt of the message, Branch and his North Carolinians, marching down river on Jackson's right, encounter a sizable force of Union cavalry and pickets. A vigorous skirmish ensues. The delay means that Branch will arrive too late to take part in any action near Mechanicsville that day. Jackson's and Ewell's columns continue slogging ahead on parallel roads. By 10 a.m., Jackson and Ewell have cleared the railroad. In the lead, Ewell turns to the right 3/4 of a mile past the tracks, pushing southward toward Shady Grove Church. Jackson continues for another mile and then turns right in the direction of Pole Green Church. Destroyed bridges, makeshift barricades, and enemy sniper fire continues to slow Jackson's progress. Jackson sends Branch a second note at 10 a.m., informing him the Valley Army is now 2 miles beyond the railroad and pressing ahead. Again, Branch fails to forward the message to other commanders. The two dispatches constitute the sum of all communication between Jackson and anyone in the Army of Northern Virginia that day. At 3 p.m., Hood's Texans skirmish briskly with Union cavalry near Chickahominy Creek, then have to repair the bridge after the withdrawing Federals destroy it. Having assumed Jackson's approach would so threaten Porter that the Union general would retire without offering battle, Lee has charted Jackson's movement on a faulty map that places Pole Green Church near the headwaters of Beaver Dam Creek. The church, however, is actually almost 3 miles north of the creek's northern edge. At Hunley's Corner, Jackson is in no position to turn Porter out of his works. Jackson orders his men into bivouac in a state of semi-readiness, but fails to notify Lee or anyone else of his army's arrival. With almost 3 hours of daylight remaining and the sounds of battle to the south growing more intense, Jackson's failure to inform Lee of his presence at Hunley's Corner is an inexplicable lapse, especially for one of the Confederacy's most aggressive and experienced battlefield commanders. At 3 p.m., having heard nothing from Branch or Jackson, Major General A.P. Hill, Jackson's old West Point classmate, runs out of patience. Richmond is in jeopardy, he later writes, and any delay would hazard the failure of the entire plan. The always aggressive Hill crosses the Chickahominy and initiates Lee's offensive on his own. Surely, Hill thinks, Jackson would be present by the time he makes contact. With Brigadier General Charles Field's 2,000-man brigade of untested Virginians in the lead, followed in turn by those of Brigadier Generals James J. Archer, Joseph R. Anderson, Maxcy Gregg, and Dorsey Pender, Hill crosses Meadow Bridge and rapidly drives enemy pickets from his fronts. The Federals begin falling back towards Mechanicsville, a small crossroads cluster of houses that lay in the open, surrounded by tilled fields. With Hill's men in pursuit, Pender's and Gregg's brigades swing to the right to provide flank protection for Hill's main thrust, which is now surging across the open fields towards Mechanicsville. East of the village, a 6-gun Union battery opens up, exacting a considerable toll on the men of Field's vanguard, while sharpshooters hidden behind a ridge open fire as well. Lee, watching from the Chickahominy bluff south of the river near the Mechanicsville Bridge, sees Confederate troops advancing through the shell-swept village and observes, those are A.P. Hill's men. Lee has not intended that there would be any real fighting at Mechanicsville, but here's Hill finding his way eastward against stronger than expected resistance. Lee quickly orders Major Generals James Longstreet and D.H. Hill to put their divisions into action. Lee accompanies D.H. Hill's troops as they cross the Chickahominy and proceed up the Mechanicsville Turnpike, with Longstreet's division following. A.P. Hill's troops of the Light Division are securing Mechanicsville when Lee arrives and learns to his dismay that he has attacked without Jackson. General Lee is now in an extremely difficult situation. 2/3 of his army are north of the river. Battle has been joined. Union forces are consolidating east of Mechanicsville, behind Beaver Dam Creek, and Richmond is left virtually unguarded. Although he desperately wants to avoid a clash with entrenched Federals, Lee decides there is nothing to do but continue the assault. With the sun starting its descent and President Davis and his entourage now on hand to watch the battle, Major General A.P. Hill eagerly leads 3 full infantry brigades, those of Anderson, Archer, and Field, eastward, planning to strike hard at Porter's right flank where he believes Jackson will momentarily appear. J.R. Anderson's troops move obliquely in that direction and deploy north of Old Church Road with a lone artillery battery, Captain Carter in Braxton's Virginia Battery ordered the Fredericksburg Artillery in support. Archer's brigade follows and takes up positions astride Old Church Road on Anderson's right. Field then posts his brigade on Archer's right, south of Old Church Road. Gregg and Pender and Branch remain uncommitted, as Hill's men deploy in lines of battle and move forward. McCall's batteries on the high ground behind Beaver Dam Creek open fire, dividing their attention between the attacking lines of infantry and a few Confederate artillery batteries that are soon silenced with heavy losses. As the Confederates move down the slope and near the creek, McCall's troops prepare for action. A Pennsylvania private remembered his major encouraging him and his comrades to give them hell or get it ourselves. Brigadier General John Reynolds rides along the 1st Brigade's battle line, pointing out targets to his Pennsylvania reservists, extorting, "Look at them, boys. In the swamp there, they are thick as fleas on gingerbread. Fire low, fire low." His riflemen wait until the attacking line is within 100 yards before opening up. One Pennsylvania private recalled that the enemy charged bayonets on us 3 times, but we cut them down. I fired until my gun got so hot that I could barely hold it in my hands. We piled them up by the hundreds, making a perfect bridge across the swamp. At about 3 p.m., the Confederate lines are formed in McCall's front, and the skirmishers rapidly advance, delivering their fire as they approach the Pennsylvania Reserve's lines. They are quickly answered by McCall's artillery and a general discharge of musketry. The men of the 35th Georgia, followed by the 14th Georgia, both from J.R. Anderson's brigade, advance with headlong energy against the 2nd Pennsylvania Reserves, only to be mowed down by the steady fire of the entrenched riflemen, whose commander, Lieutenant Colonel William McClellan, soon sends to the rear some 7 or 8 prisoners taken in the encounter. "We fought under many disadvantages," Colonel Martin Ledbetter of the 5th Alabama Battalion recalled. "It was with great difficulty that we made our way through the entanglement of treetops, saplings, vines, and every other conceivable obstruction under a heavy fire. Within an hour, hundreds of dead and wounded Confederate soldiers blanket the terrain west of Beaver Dam Creek, as the fighting intensifies along the mile-long front on both sides of Old Church Road. A.P. Hill is in the middle of it, hatless, begrimed, and oblivious to danger as he urges his men forward by personal example. He fails, however, to utilize the concentrated firepower of his division's 9 artillery batteries to contest the enemy's guns. On the far right, despite the withering fire, some of Anderson's 35th Georgia troops doggedly fight their way back across the 12-foot creek and establish a beachhead of sorts, giving the men of the 2nd Pennsylvania Reserve some anxious moments. One Union officer who faced the Georgians remembered, "At one time they attacked a right and center at the same time, boldly pressing on their flags until they nearly met ours. When the fighting became of the most desperate character, the flags rising and falling as they surged to and fro by the contending parties. When some of Reynolds' infantrymen run out of ammunition, McCall sends forward 2 fresh regiments, the 4th Michigan and 14th New York of Brigadier General Charles Griffin's 2nd Brigade and Morrell's 1st Division. Meade brings up his 2nd Brigade's 4 regiments into line as well. Under infantry fire and enemy cannon firing double-shotted canister into their ranks at close range, the men of the 35th Georgia are hard-pressed to hold their small piece of captured ground. Men of the 14th and 49th Georgia regiments struggle mightily to come up in support of their comrades, but are driven back with appalling losses. Without reinforcements and ammunition resupply, the survivors of the 35th Georgia later fall back across the creek under cover of darkness. On the right, the men of Archer's and Field's brigades, loading and firing as they advance, also suffer terribly under the withering storm of shot and shell. Neither brigade comes close to making a dent in the Union line. With 3 of A.P. Hill's infantry brigades stalled in front of the Union center and right and still no sign of Jackson, Lee decides a little after 6 p.m. to send another of Hill's brigades to test the Federal left near Ellerson's Mill. The assignment falls to Pender's brigade, supported by a brigade of D.H. Hill's division that had arrived on the field, commanded by Brigadier General Roswell Ripley. By the time the divisions of D.H. Hill and Longstreet arrive, there is too much confusion and too little daylight remaining for Lee to effectively deploy and utilize them. Pender, one of the Confederacy's most promising young officers, having been awarded a battlefield promotion to brigadier general by President Davis for his actions at Seven Pines, leads his exposed units across a broad plateau and down the slope towards the creek, as his 4 North Carolina regiments and a battalion each of Virginians and Arkansans near Ellison's Mill. They feel the sting of more than a dozen Union cannons and supporting infantry fire. A lone Virginia artillery unit, Captain W.G. Andrews' Virginia Battery, boldly moves forward and is shattered, losing 42 of 92 men. Of the suicidal advance, Confederate Colonel Edwin Porter Alexander wrote, "A more hopeless charge was never entered upon." When Ripley comes up, the 2nd Arkansas Battalion from Pender's brigade is moved ahead as skirmishers in Pender's front, directly into the face of the enemy defenders entrenched above Ellison's Mill. 2 of his regiments, the 44th Georgia and 1st North Carolina, attack on Pender's right, while the 48th Georgia and 3rd North Carolina advance on the left. The 2nd Arkansas Battalion is so severely crippled that there are no officers in the battalion left alive to report their enormous casualties. The battalion would later be consolidated with the 3rd Arkansas Infantry Regiment shortly after the 7 days had concluded. McCall later wrote of the failed Confederate assault. After a time, a heavy column was launched down the road to Ellison's Mill, where a determined attack was made. I had already sent Easton's battery to General Seymour, and I now moved the 7th Regiment down to the extreme left, apprehending that the enemy might attempt to turn that flank by crossing the stream below the mill. Here, however, the reserves maintained their position and sustained their character for steadiness and splendid style, never losing a foot of ground during a severe struggle with some of the best troops of the enemy, fighting under the direction of their most distinguished general. For hour after hour the battle was hotly contested, and the rapid fire of our artillery, dealing death to an awful extent, was unintermitted. Limping back from the creek under ruinous fire, the walking wounded brings news of the attack's failure. The always caustic D.H. Hill says later, the result was, as might have been foreseen, a bloody and disastrous repulse. The 44th Georgia makes it to the creek's western edge and fights bravely for almost 2 hours, finally running out of ammunition and losing 361 men killed or wounded of the regiment's 514 members. The 1st North Carolina loses 133, including its colonel, lieutenant colonel, major, 6 captains, and 10 lieutenants. Of the 14,000 Union soldiers engaged at the Battle of Beaver Dam Creek, or Battle of Mechanicsville as it becomes known to the Southerners, only 361 become casualties. The Confederates suffer 1,484 casualties. Ripley's brigade suffers the worst, losing a staggering 575 men killed, wounded, or missing, about 60% of its strength. Around sunset, Griffin's brigade arrives on the field and takes up a supporting position to Reynolds' rear. Porter wisely extends his right flank, dispatching Brigadier General John Martindale's 1st Brigade of Morrell's division to a point behind Reynolds' position, where he can guard against any enemy approach over the road from Hanover Courthouse. There, Martindale skirmishes briefly with some of Jackson's advanced pickets. Nightfall brings an end to the infantry fighting, although artillery and sniper fire continues for several hours. In their first major encounter on the 2nd day of the 7 days battles, General Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia have suffered a severe repulse, Lee managing to get less than a fourth of his available troops into action, and then only in costly piecemeal frontal assaults against entrenched enemy positions. Mechanicsville is the worst fiasco committed by either side since the Battle of Ball's Bluff back in October 1861, this time with the lopsided casualty figures reversed. McClellan wires Secretary of War Edwin Stanton that evening, "Victory today complete and against great odds. I almost begin to think we are invincible." As night falls over the bloody battlefield of Beaver Dam Creek at the end of June 26, the capture of Richmond is unquestionably within McClellan's reach. Porter's reinforced 5th Corps, now more than 30,000 strong, holds near impregnable positions north of the Chickahominy, backed by concentrated artillery batteries. McClellan commands 67,000 fresh troops south of the river opposite 23,000 Confederates, many of them green reinforcements, while Lee's bloodied forces north of the river are scattered and disjointed. There has been no word from Jackson since morning and no one knows his whereabouts. McClellan has 2 golden opportunities. He could exploit the victory by heavily reinforcing Porter north of the river, go on the offensive there, and destroy the enemy's army, or, as several of his subordinates implore him to do, McClellan could instruct Porter to hold the river crossings while he himself attacked south of the river with almost a 3-to-1 numerical superiority and capture the enemy's capital. Instead, McClellan would do neither, giving the initiative back to Lee once more to continue his counteroffensive the next day. McClellan begins to withdraw his army to the southeast and will never regain the initiative in the campaign. Porter's 5th Corps, much to the surprise of its victorious soldiers, is ordered on the night of June 26-27th to withdraw to a new defensive position behind Bosun's Creek, near the Chickahominy River, close to the position of Old Cold Harbor and Gaines Mill. It would be here on the next day, June 27th, that General Lee would launch the Confederacy's largest attack of the war in the Battle of Gaines Mill.